The floor was cold, not the kind of cold that comes from air conditioning or a winter morning. This was the cold of concrete that had never known warmth, the cold of sealed earth of 60 years of darkness, of a space that had been built for a purpose and then abandoned, and then repurposed for a purpose no one would write down. It came through clothing and found bone. It made a person aware very specifically of every place their body touched the ground. Tessa Harmon was aware of all of it. She was lying on her left side in a hallway 40 feet below the surface of a mountain in the Republic of Georgia. The hallway smelled of rust and old diesel and the particular chemical signature of Soviet-era concrete, which is different from every other kind of concrete in the world, as though the ideology of the people who poured it had worked its way into the mixture. Her left hand was pressed flat against her right shoulder, where a fragment from a burst pipe driven by a pressure charge detonated 2 floors above had opened a gash across the top of the deltoid muscle. She had assessed it in the first 3 seconds. Not arterial, significant bleeding but manageable. 40 minutes perhaps before blood loss became a relevant variable in her decision-making. She had noted this the way a mechanic notes a warning light. Acknowledged, filed, set aside. Her right hand held the radio. "Dalton?" Her voice was level, not performed calmness, not the tight, effortful control of someone fighting panic. Simply level. The way a voice is level when the person using it has been in enough situations to know that panic is a luxury with costs she was not willing to pay. Kowalski is 12 feet from the eastern junction. He needs to move left into the alcove before the next patrol sweep. He has 8 seconds. 40 feet away in the dark, boots shifted on concrete. Halt 2 hostiles between you and the stairwell. 1 stationary at the base, the second is mobile moving toward you now. He passes the generator housing every 45 seconds. You have a window in 20. She knew where everyone was. She had memorized the layout of this facility the way a navigator memorizes a chart, not by trying, but by needing to. She had been watching, listening, and counting since the moment they entered. The angles, the sight lines, the geometry of a space that wanted to kill them and could be made with sufficient attention into a space that would not. This was not what Navy corpsmen were trained to do. It was something else entirely. A figure moved through the darkness toward her, low and fast, the practiced crouch of a man who had spent years making himself smaller in dangerous spaces. Garrett Sloan dropped to one knee beside her penlight, clenched in his teeth, medkit already open. He was the team's assigned medic, and he was good at his job. And right now he was looking at Tessa Harmon with the expression of a man who has placed something in a category and is beginning to suspect the category was wrong. He worked on her shoulder efficiently. She let him. She kept the radio in her right hand and her eyes on the far end of the hallway. When he finished, he pulled out his field notebook. Standard procedure. Every casualty logged and reported. The Navy did not believe in informality when it came to documentation, even in situations like this one, and Sloan did not believe in it either. Name, he said quietly. Harmon, Tessa, HM2. Unit attachment. CIA contractor. Corpsman support. He wrote it down, turned to the next field. His pen was already moving, anticipating the answer the way a pen moves when the question is routine and the answer is expected to be routine. Call sign. Tessa Harmon was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then she said 2 words. Garrett Sloan's pen stopped. At the far end of the hallway, Rex Dalton, who had been in continuous motion for 11 minutes, who had been operating on the kind of forward momentum that 3 decades of special operations builds into a man's nervous system, went still. Not gradually, the way a clock stops. From motion to absolute rest with nothing between. He did not turn around. His shoulders rose 1 degree and held there. Kowalski pressed into the alcove she had directed him toward, turned his head. He looked at Dalton's back, then at the woman on the floor. Something moved across his face that was not quite recognition and not quite understanding. Something older and less comfortable than either. Nobody spoke. The hallway was silent except for the distant hum of a generator and the faint movement of boots 2 floors above them. This is where the story begins. Not in a briefing room in Tbilisi, not on a helicopter cutting low through mountain valleys in the dark. Here in the cold, in the silence, in the weight of 2 words settling over 7 people who did not all yet understand what they were hearing. To understand what those 2 words meant, you have to go back 72 hours. Tbilisi sits at the place where Europe stops being certain it is Europe. Ancient stone churches, the color of old honey, stand a short walk from Soviet apartment blocks that were built to demonstrate permanence and are quietly proving the demonstration was optimistic. The Makvari River moves through the center of it all, gray-green and indifferent the way rivers are. Colonel Alan Marsh met Tessa Harmon in the lobby of a hotel at 3 in the morning. He was 57 years old, silver-haired, and stood with the bearing of a man who had worn a uniform long enough that the absence of one never fully registered. He laid out the mission the way a careful man lays out facts he has selected in order without gaps, with the confident completeness of someone who has decided in advance what the other person needs to know. A Ukrainian scientist named Volkov, a specialist in biological containment systems, taken 11 days ago from a conference in Yerevan. Current intelligence placed him in a former Soviet mining facility in the Greater Caucasus Range, approximately 180 kilometers north of the city. A SEAL element was in country. They needed a qualified corpsman. Their primary medic had been pulled for a family emergency. Mission window 48 hours. Tessa listened to all of it. She asked one question: what's on the third level? Marsh paused for less than a second. The facility has two confirmed sublevels, B1 and B2. Volkov is believed to be on B2. Believed. Intelligence is rarely perfect, Ms. Harmon. She looked at him for a moment, not the look of distrust, but the look of measurement. The look she used when she was deciding what something actually was, as opposed to what it had been presented as. Then she nodded and said she understood the mission. She did understand it, just not in the way Marsh intended. The safe house was a two-story building in the suburbs, unremarkable from the street, the kind of place that exists in every city where serious people need to be near airports without being near anything else. Inside, it had been converted into something functional, and austere maps on the walls, satellite imagery pinned to boards, a folding table with communications equipment that cost more than most people's houses. The team was already there when she arrived. Rex Dalton turned when she entered. 58 years old, built like a man who had spent his entire adult life carrying heavy things in difficult conditions and had arrived at a complete peace with this fact. His eyes were pale blue and very still. He looked at her the way experienced people look at new additions, not unfriendly, not welcoming. Assessing, the way you assess weather before a long drive. Harmon, he said, you're the corpsman. Yes, sir. He nodded once and turned back to the map. Kowalski spoke from the far wall, arms crossed, carrying the posture of a man who has been doing a job for a long time and has strong opinions about who else should be permitted to do it. No offense, he said, and the two words held the weight of a man who means a great deal of offense. But I requested an operator, not somebody to organize the bandages. Tessa set her bag down near the door. She was already looking at the maps. No offense taken, she said. Kowalski waited for more. There was no more. Fletcher Holt had not spoken since she arrived. He stood at the window with his coffee, watching her look at the maps with the particular quality of attention he used for things that did not fit neatly into the space where he had placed them. He was 46 years old and had spent 20 years learning to read people, the way experienced sailors read water, for current, for depth, for what moves beneath the surface. What he noticed was that she was not reading the maps the way a medic reads maps. She was not tracing evacuation routes or casualty collection points. She was reading terrain, angles of approach, fields of fire, the relationship between the topography and the structure of the facility viewed from inside out, not asking how to survive in the space, but how to control it. He finished his coffee and said nothing. Travis Weld introduced himself with a nod from across the room. 31 years old, direct in the way of someone who had been deployed enough times to have stopped maintaining the social performances that people deploy when they are trying to make an impression. Garrett Sloan came to her with the professional curiosity of one medical person meeting another, and was satisfied, or at least professionally satisfied, by what she told him: 2 deployments with a Marine recon element in Afghanistan, 18 months in a forward surgical unit, a list of certifications she recited without inflection. The questions he did not ask about the 18 months of her service record that were redacted to near non-existence, he stored for later. The mission brief lasted 90 minutes. Dalton ran it. The facility was built into the remnants of a Soviet manganese mine scattered through the Caucasus in the mid-20th century, like coins dropped from a pocket. Most abandoned, some repurposed. This one significantly so. 2 confirmed sublevels. 20 to 25 armed personnel. A single viable extraction route. Tessa listened to all of it. She asked 2 questions, both precise, and Dalton answered them without comment. When the brief ended and the others moved to their equipment and their preparations, she stayed at the map table. She was looking at a notation at the bottom of the satellite image. 3 words: possible lower structure unconfirmed. Unconfirmed. She had been carrying that word for 7 years. The MH-6 Little Bird flew low through mountain valleys below radar coverage, below the altitude that makes aircraft visible to people on high ground. The night was clear, and the Greater Caucasus was enormous in a way that makes even very serious people feel briefly very small. Through the PVS-14 night vision, the world was green and white and slightly flat, a photograph of itself. She leaned toward Holt and said quietly, "There's a dead zone on the north approach. The satellite shows uniform slope, but the runoff patterns suggest a shelf about 200 meters out. If there are observation posts not in the intel package, that's where they'd be." Holt looked at her. She had already looked back at the terrain. He said nothing. But 10 minutes from the LZ, he mentioned the shelf to Dalton, framing it as his own observation. Dalton adjusted the approach vector by 15 degrees. They came down in a cleared area near a dry stream bed, the little bird lifting back into the dark before it had properly touched. The cold arrived immediately, mountain cold, the kind that finds every gap in clothing and does not negotiate. They moved into the darkness in formation. Dalton forward, Holt on his shoulder, Kowalski and Weld in the middle, Sloan behind them. Tessa at the rear where they had placed her, which told her precisely what she needed to know about how she was being categorized. The LZ was flat rock and dried grass, stiff and pale in the NVG light. She stepped over the first cluster of rocks, moved between two larger ones, and her right foot came down on a surface that presented itself as stable and was not. The rock shifted. Her weight transferred wrong. In the first second, it was not pain. It was the announcement of pain, the sharp, specific signal of something structural going wrong. She put her left foot down, redistributed her weight, and kept moving. 3 feet ahead of her, no one turned around. She noted the injury with the same part of her mind she used for everything else, functionally, practically as a variable to be managed. She had a mission. The mission was not finished. She kept moving. The facility entrance they used was a ventilation access point from the original mining operation, a steel door set into the rock face, corroded at the hinges but operational. They breached it in under 40 seconds. Inside smelled of time, the specific accumulation of decades in a sealed space diesel metal, and the chemical signature of treated Soviet concrete. The first level was a network of corridors connecting what had once been equipment storage and administrative space. Low ceilings, fluorescent lights at long intervals, most failing, creating long stretches of near darkness between pools of pale yellow. They cleared it in sections, two moving two, covering the rhythm of a team that had done this together many times. In the third corridor, Tessa found Travis Weld on the ground. He had been forward when the pressure charge detonated somewhere above them. The shockwave had moved through the corridor structure, and a pipe section had failed at a joint, and the fragment had taken him in the chest on the right side. He was down and breathing, but the breathing was wrong. Sloan reached him first and began his primary assessment, airway, breathing, circulation, automatic, as a heartbeat. He found the entry wound, found no exit, found labored breathing. He reached for his kit. Tessa was already beside him. She had not waited to be directed. She was looking at Weld's neck, at the visible distension of the jugular vein, at the trachea sitting slightly off-center, and she put her hand on his chest and felt the absence of breath sounds on the right side. "Tension pneumothorax," she said. "Right side. 60 seconds before cardiac output drops enough to matter." Sloan had reached the same conclusion half a second behind her. The needle was already in his hand. Kowalski, 10 feet back, weapon covering the far corridor, said not quietly enough, "We're taking fire. We don't have 60 seconds. Her voice had not changed, not louder, not sharper. "Then it becomes a different problem. Your call." Kowalski looked at Dalton. Dalton looked at Weld, at Sloan's hands, at the needle. "Do it," he said. Sloan worked with the speed of a man who has done this in real conditions and not in training environments. 14-gauge needle second, intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. A sound like pressure releasing, which is precisely what it was. Weld's breathing changed. The gasping quality left it. He was still injured, still needed more work, but the 60-second clock had been stopped. Sloan exhaled. He looked at Tessa. She was already watching the end of the corridor. Kowalski was looking at nothing in particular, the look of a man recalibrating something he had already decided he had calibrated correctly. They kept moving. The hallway where the next problem happened was longer than the others, with one working bank of fluorescence that cast the space in steady pale light. The team was stacked against the left wall, moving toward a junction 40 feet ahead when the figure appeared. He came from the cross corridor at the junction, walking, looking at something in his hand. His weapon was on a sling, not in his hands. He had not heard them. He was a man doing a routine task in a space he considered controlled. He was 12 feet from Tessa Harmon. A shot at that distance, even suppressed, would echo in enclosed concrete. In a facility with multiple hostiles on multiple floors, one sound at the wrong moment rewrites every timeline. Tessa moved. What she did in this next 3 seconds was not improvisation. It was geometry, a specific sequence of movements with specific mechanics practiced until it had moved below the level of decision into the level of the body. The hostile was down in 3 seconds, controlled, quiet, still breathing. Tessa straightened, adjusted the strap of her kit, and looked at the junction. The corridor was silent. No one moved for 3 full seconds. Fletcher Holt stepped forward, and as he passed Tessa, his eyes went to her left wrist where her sleeve had pushed up slightly. A scar ran along the lateral forearm. Not surgical, not the clean line of a planned incision. Something older and less deliberate. He looked at it for 1 second. He had been in the field long enough to know the difference between scars from hospitals and scars from other things. He filed it in the place he kept information he had not yet decided what to do with. Dalton reached for his radio at the junction. Standard check-in with Marsh, 60-minute intervals. He keyed the frequency. Static. He tried again. Static. Holt checked his. Kowalski checked his without being asked. The same. Signal jamming, systematic, total coverage, not accidental. It requires equipment intention and knowledge of specific frequencies. Knowledge of their frequencies. Dalton stood at the junction and looked at the radio in his hand and at the stairwell that led down. He was 58 years old and had accumulated over 3 decades a precise understanding of the difference between things that go wrong by chance and things that go wrong by design. The weight he was feeling right now was not paranoia. It was pattern recognition. He put the radio away. B2, he said. They went down. Tessa went with them last in the formation, her right leg carrying her without complaint. The pain held in the category she had assigned it, not gone, not denied. Simply placed where she could manage it rather than be managed by it. She had been walking on a broken leg for 2 hours. No one knew. She had a mission. She kept moving. Far below, in a room that existed on no official record, Marsh watched a monitor. The image was green and white, the same world seen through the same kind of lens from the other side. He watched the column of figures descend a stairwell toward the second sublevel. He watched them with the expression of a man watching a chess piece move toward a square he has spent a long time preparing. He looked at the figure at the back of the column, smaller than the others, moving with an economy that was not the economy of a medic. He had made one mistake 20 years ago and had spent every year since managing it. Tonight, that management would be complete. The problem would be solved permanently in a place he controlled by people he controlled under circumstances that would be documented as an operational failure. Tragic. Classified, filed, and sealed. He turned from the monitor. Below the mountain, Tessa Harmon descended into the dark, one careful step at a time, and did not stop. The second sublevel was different. Not the way one floor differs from another, different ceiling, height, different paint. Different the way one era differs from another. The first level had the deterioration of Soviet construction left to manage its own decline. Concrete swelling and cracking along its own fault lines. Steel oxidizing through shades of brown. The slow entropy of things built to last forever by people who no longer existed to maintain them. B2 had been touched recently. The floor was resurfaced. The walls were clean. The doors were steel with electronic locks on new hinges. Someone had invested in this space not for comfort, but for a specific and deliberate functionality that required resources and intention, and a reason that appeared on no official document. Tessa noted the cameras as they cleared the stairwell entrance. 4 of them, ceiling-mounted, small and reliable rather than conspicuous, positioned to cover the corridor with overlapping fields of view. No gaps, no blind spots. The indicator lights on all 4 were active. Someone was watching right now. She said nothing. She filed it alongside the broken leg and the jammed radios, and the look Marsh had given her when she asked about the lower level, a collection of things accumulating toward a conclusion she already had most of the pieces to reach. They found Volkov at the end of the corridor. The lock on his door had been shot out from the inside. He was on a metal frame cot when they entered, and he looked at them with the wariness of a man who has been in a room long enough to know that people coming through the door are not always the people you want. He was 53 years old, and the 11 days of captivity had done visible work on him. Weight loss and exhaustion that had gone past tiredness into something structural. But his eyes were clear, and his posture when he stood was the posture of a man who had not surrendered anything he considered essential. He looked at Dalton, then he looked at Tessa. He held her gaze. He said in careful English with a Ukrainian inflection, "They know you are here. They have been waiting." Dalton said, "Who knows?" "The people who arranged this." He did not look away from Tessa. "They were not waiting for your team. They were waiting for her." The room held the silence for a moment. 7 people in a space designed for one and all of them still. Tessa moved toward Volkov and began a medical assessment pulse pupils, a systematic inventory of injuries. She did not look at Dalton. She did not look at anyone. But the line of her jaw had tightened by exactly 1 degree. Dalton watched her. He looked at Holt. Holt gave him the small neutral expression that meant, I have been watching her since Tbilisi, and I have thoughts. But now is not the time. Now was not the time. They needed to move. The extraction route ran back through B1 and up through the ventilation access, then 900 meters across open ground to the secondary LZ where the little bird would return during a 15-minute window. A tight plan on a reasonable timeline, the kind that works when variables cooperate. Holt found the sniper with the FLIR before anyone else. A thermal signature on the ridge line above the secondary LZ well-positioned, chosen with intelligence. The man had known this exit route in advance, which meant the intel package had been compromised, which meant the situation was no longer the situation they had planned for. The position commanded the entire open ground between the facility exit and the LZ. Distance from the ridge to the farthest crossing point, approximately 820 meters. In the dark, with wind off the mountain from the northwest at 11 miles per hour, with no viable approach to the position without detection. The terrain on either side was impassable slope or open exposure. There was no around. The team's assigned sniper was Petty Officer Second-Class Rourke, 9 years of long-range work for SEAL teams, a spotter's eye, a shooter's patience, a catalog of harder shots made under worse conditions. He had also 40 minutes earlier taken a fragment from the same pressure charge that injured Weld. His wound was managed and bandaged, but his right arm was compromised, and when he settled behind the rifle and tried to establish a proper position, his right hand gave him what an injured arm gives a right-handed shooter working a precision weapon in cold conditions. Nothing useful. He looked at Dalton. He didn't need to say it. Dalton looked at the team. Holt on the FLIR, Kowalski covering the rear, Sloan managing Volkov. Weld mobile but running on whatever adrenaline had left in reserve. He looked at Tessa Harmon. She was 6 feet away watching the ridge line through her NVGs. She had been watching it since Holt calls the contact. She had not moved toward the rifle or made any gesture of intention. She was waiting in the way she always waited, completely, still completely present. Can you shoot? Dalton said. Yes, sir. 800 meters, more in this wind. I know the distance, she said. I've been looking at it. He looked at her for one more second. The rifle was a Barrett M82A 1.50 caliber, 30 pounds, of precision engineering resting on its bipod. It is not a weapon you pick up casually. The recoil alone, improperly managed, had broken collarbones. It requires specific training, specific technique, and significant time to operate at the distances it was designed for. Tessa settled behind it with the economy of someone returning to a familiar place. Her left hand found the bipod grip. Her right hand found the stock. Her cheek came to the comb in one continuous motion, no adjustment, no searching, no moment of orientation. She absorbed the weight of the weapon, the way you absorb the weight of something you have been carrying long enough for it to stop feeling like additional weight and start feeling like part of yourself. She was still for 4 seconds. On the ridge, the thermal signature shifted, the sniper adjusting his own position. Patient, certain he had time. He did not have as much time as he believed. Tessa exhaled slowly, a long, controlled exhale that emptied the lungs and let the body settle into its minimum movement. In the stillness between one heartbeat and the next, she squeezed the trigger. The Barrett speaks in a register that is less sound than a vent, a concussive pressure that moves through the chest before the brain has finished registering the report. It expanded into the cold mountain air and disappeared. On the ridge, the thermal signature stopped moving. 3 seconds of silence. Kowalski turned from his rear position. He looked at the ridge. He looked at the woman behind the rifle. He had an expression that had nothing to do with skepticism and everything to do with recalculation. Holt checked the FLIR. Target down. Dalton said, move. They moved. They did not hold a conversation until they were back inside, because outside with a compromised exit was not a place for it. The questions accumulated in the silence of corridors and stairwells and waited until Dalton called a halt in a defensible position near the B2 access where they could hear approaches from both directions. Then he looked at Tessa and said, your father. Not a question, a beginning. He taught me, she said. What else was he? She looked at Dalton for a moment, then at the floor. The look of a person deciding how much of a locked room to open and deciding for now against the door. This isn't the time, she said. Holt spoke from his position near the wall. He spoke quietly in the manner of a man who has been keeping his own counsel for a long time and has decided the time for that is passing. 820 meters, he said. 11-mile-per-hour crosswind. Darkness, first round. A pause. That is not a skill you develop on a range. That is a career. Tessa said nothing. 18 months of your file, he continued. Redacted completely. 2 years ago. I know most of the reasons files get redacted. The kind in your file is specific. It happens when someone needs to not exist for a period of time. The corridor was quiet except for the generator and the distant sounds of a facility that did not yet know how much its situation had changed. Dalton said after, one word carrying both a promise and a deferral. When we can afford to finish this, we will. She nodded once. Sloan found it the way medics find things systematically, methodically, without the production of drama, because the absence of drama is what the job requires. He moved through the team in sequence after the contact checking each person. When he reached Tessa, she was standing at her position watching the corridor. She allowed his approach with the cooperative stillness of someone accustomed to assessment, not making his job easier, but not making it harder. He started at the top and worked down. At her right leg, he stopped. The fabric on the lower right was a different shade than the left, darker in a pattern he recognized before he touched it. He crouched and ran his hands carefully along the lower leg, reading with his fingers what his eyes could not confirm in the dim light. He looked up at her face. She was still watching the corridor. When he said, LZ, he calculated. 6 hours since the LZ. 6 hours of full kit mountain terrain room clearing, a needle decompression in the dark, disarming a hostile with her hands, and one shot at 820 meters. Stress fracture at minimum, he said, possibly complete. You have been walking on this for... I know what I've been walking on. You made that shot on this leg. The shot was the easy part. Weld had heard all of it from where he sat against the wall. The man whose lungs she had saved looked at Tessa with a quality of attention that goes beyond observation, the specific attention of a person who understands in a way that is physical and not merely intellectual what another person's actions have cost them. Dalton came to stand before her. Can you continue? Yes. I need more than yes. I can continue, she said. I will tell you when I can't. 3 seconds. He was not deciding whether to believe her. He had already decided. He was deciding something else, something that had been accumulating since the safe house in Tbilisi, since she had stood at the map table and looked at the space between what the brief contained and what it did not. After, he said. After, she said. Sloan fashioned a field splint from materials in his kit and applied it without speaking. It was not a repair. It was a management tool, and they both understood the difference. Doc looked at her when he finished. You need evacuation. After the mission, she said. He looked at the splint, looked at her face, said nothing more. The field report was a formality Sloan maintained under any conditions because he believed in the practical way of someone who has seen enough to understand it, that the formalities which seem most unnecessary in a crisis are often the ones that matter most when the crisis is over. He worked through the list. Weld's injury, Rourke's laceration, Tessa's fracture, then call signs, standard entry. Communications purposes. Every person in a classified environment identifiable by designation. Dalton, Holt, Kowalski, Weld, Rourke, Sloan himself. He reached Tessa. Call sign, he said. His pen was already moving, anticipating the answer. Tessa was quiet for 2 seconds. Then she said ghost actual. The pen stopped moving. At the far end of the corridor, Rex Dalton went still. Not gradually. The way a clock stops from motion to absolute rest with nothing in between. He had been moving, then he was not. His back was to her and remained to her, and his shoulders came up 1 degree and held. Kowalski looked at Dalton's back. He had known this man for 14 years. He had watched him function in conditions that would have dismantled most people. He had never seen him go still like that, not once in 14 years. He looked at Tessa. He looked back at Dalton. Sloan said very quietly, I'm sorry, could you... Ghost actual, Tessa said. That is my call sign. Dalton turned around. It was a slow turn, not reluctant but deliberate, the turn of a man giving himself the time to decide what his face will show before others see it. What it showed was something that had no name in the vocabulary that professional soldiers develop over time to exclude the things that cannot be managed in the field. Something old, something that had been held for 20 years in a space where it could not be set down and had not been, and was now without warning being asked to move. Who assigned you that call sign, he said. No one assigned it, I chose it. Why, Moa? Because it was my father's. The corridor was completely silent. Your father's name, Dalton said. Ryan Harmon, she said. Lieutenant Commander, SEAL Team 6, Ghost Actual. She paused. Listed as killed in action. Fallujah, November 2004. Rex Dalton looked at Tessa Harmon for a very long time. He looked at her the way you look at something you have been carrying in memory, imperfect, compressed by time, and are now unexpectedly being asked to put alongside the real thing and measure the distance between them. He said, I was there. The words came out in the register of things held too long in too small a space. Tessa said, I know. This is what Rex Dalton had known since November of 2004, 20 years of knowing a thing that could not be spoken. Ryan Harmon did not die in Fallujah. He was listed as killed in action in the after-action documentation of a nighttime direct-action mission in the western portion of the city. The listing was accurate in that he was gone and did not return. It was not accurate in any other sense. What actually happened was that the position of his element had been known before the mission began, known by the people they were going to because someone with access to the operational planning, someone inside the chain, someone with clearances and a career and a long history of being trusted, had made a calculation. The kind of calculation that gets made in intelligence work, when one thing is weighed against another, with the cold arithmetic of someone who has stopped seeing people as people and started seeing them as values on a ledger. A controlled disclosure, a strategic compromise. The position of a four-man SEAL element exchanged for access to an intelligence network that was deemed by whoever made the decision to be worth more. Ryan Harmon and the two men with him were captured rather than killed because the receiving party wanted them alive. Not out of mercy, out of utility. Men with knowledge have value. Men with knowledge held in undisclosed locations have a specific kind of value, the kind that does not expire, the kind that can be controlled and kept available. The man who had made the calculation was named Marsh. Dalton had learned the truth in 2006 through a source he would not name. He had spent the years since running the same arithmetic repeatedly from different angles, looking for a configuration in which disclosure produced a better outcome than silence. The math never improved. Marsh had accumulated institutional authority that functioned as its own protection. The further up a person rises, the more expensive they become to bring down, and the fewer people are willing to pay. So Dalton had carried it. He told Tessa all of it, not quickly. In the measured cadence of testimony rather than narration, facts sequenced names as he knew them because it had never been told before and deserved the precision of a first telling. When he finished, she said, I know. He said, how long? I was 19, she said. He found a way to reach me, a file through an intermediary, enough to understand what happened, not enough to prove it. He's alive. She looked at the wall, at the floor below B2, at the notation on the satellite image she had studied in the safe house, possible lower structure, unconfirmed. I think he's here, she said. Holt from his position near the wall said quietly, the third level. He paused. I found a reference to it in the original Soviet construction records during background research. I didn't include it because it was 60 years old and unverified. He stopped. I should have included it. You couldn't have known what it meant. No, he said, but you did. She did not answer that. Dalton looked at the stairwell that continued below them. He looked at his team. He looked at the space between what his mission parameters said and what the situation actually was. He said, we go down. Kowalski said, Volkov is the objective. Mission parameters. I know the parameters, Dalton said, without heat. With the weight of a man who has followed parameters for 30 years and has arrived without drama at the place where he knows which ones were written by people who understood the situation and which were not. Kowalski looked at him, looked at Tessa, looked at the floor. He said, I'll take point. The second shot came before they reached the stairwell to B3. The radio opened, the jamming stopped, which was its own kind of information, arriving annotated with its own meaning. Marsh's voice came through clear and controlled, in the way voices are clear and controlled when the person speaking has made a decision and is in the process of executing it. He told them to abort. Take Volkov and proceed to extraction. Leave immediately. He knew precisely where they were. He knew they were at the B2 to B3 transition. Not because they had reported their position, the radio had been jammed since insertion, and they had reported nothing. Because there were cameras on B2, and the cameras were his, and he had been watching since they arrived. Dalton turned the radio off. He looked at Holt. One word, JSOC. Holt was already moving to the backup channel. 12 minutes. Then 8 armed contractors through the facility entrance, above men with good equipment, and no unit patches, and the specific purposeful movement of people who have been told that their objective is not an action, but an absence. They were not here to capture. They were here to ensure that certain people did not leave. A second sniper position materialized on the ridge, higher than the first. Better concealment. The wind had shifted northeast now 18 miles per hour with variable gusts, 1,150 meters to the ridge. Both the primary and secondary LZ approaches covered. Tessa did not wait. She was already reading the thermal through the scope, a faint variance against cold rock barely distinguishable, the kind of thing visible only because she knew exactly how to look for it. She found the natural respiratory pause, the stillness at the bottom of the exhale. She felt her own heartbeat and waited for the space between beats. 1,150 meters, 18 mile per hour crosswind with gusts, significant elevation differential. Temperature drop affecting ballistics by a calculable increment. All of it processed not as arithmetic, but as understanding the kind that lives in the body, absorbed through years of practice, until it no longer requires calculation because it has become something older and more reliable than thought. She squeezed. On the ridge, the thermal signature stopped. Nobody spoke. Nobody asked. Nobody looked at her with surprise because surprise implies the revision of an expectation, and by now no one in that corridor had any expectations left about what Tessa Harmon was and was not capable of. Kowalski moved to her left side as she rose from the firing position. He positioned himself between her and the corridor without being asked, without announcement, without any gesture that acknowledged what he was doing. He just stood there, between her and whatever was coming next. It was in its way the loudest thing he had communicated in 14 hours. The stairwell to B3 had not been regularly used. The upper steps held fresh boot prints within the last week. The lower portion had the quality of a space that had been sealed for a long time and unsealed with reluctance. Original Soviet construction on the walls stained with 60 years of mineral deposit. The air was cooler by several degrees, drier, and beneath the smell of deep earth and enclosed space, something faintly antiseptic, the smell of maintenance in a place that was not supposed to need it. Someone had been taking care of something down here. Dalton was on point. Holt behind him, Kowalski at the stairwell above. Sloan with Volkov, who was moving but limited. Weld on his feet, running on the final reserves that adrenaline provides before collecting what it's owed. Tessa at the rear, her right leg carrying her at the measured pace of a person who has negotiated with pain and is honoring the terms. She counted the steps. 17. The stairwell ended at a corridor shorter than the ones above, running east to west. 4 doors on the south side, 3 with deadlocks, no power. The 4th at the far end had an active green indicator. Powered, secured, Holt worked the bypass device. 22 seconds, a long time in a corridor when you know what's above you. The lock disengaged. Dalton pushed the door open and went in fast and low. What it contained was small and dim and cold. A room approximately 15 feet by 12. A metal frame cot against the far wall. Medical equipment assembled from available materials rather than ordered through supply channels. An IV stand of welded pipe monitoring equipment that was functional and old. A portable oxygen concentrator humming in the corner. A folding table with a water container and foil-wrapped nutrition packets of the kind used in long-duration field situations. Nothing more. On the cot, a man. On his back with his eyes closed, not deeply asleep, but conserving the way a person conserves everything, including consciousness, when circumstances have taught them that nothing should be spent unnecessarily. He was lean with the leanness of long deprivation, the body having consumed its surplus over months and years, until only the essential remained. White at the temples and gray through the rest, cut short in a style that had not been attended to recently. His hands rested on the blanket, large-knuckled, rope-veined, with the density of hands that have gripped and pulled and carried through decades of demanding work. 58 years old. He opened his eyes when he heard them enter. The eyes were gray-blue and sharp in a way that everything else about him in its current state was not. The eyes of a man whose circumstances had diminished many things, but had not reached the part that observed and understood and assessed. He looked at Dalton first. He looked for a long time. Then he said in a voice rough at the edges from disuse but clear at the center, "Rex." Dalton stood into the doorway. In 30 years of service across more operational environments than most people knew existed, Rex Dalton had trained himself away from most physical expressions of feeling, not because feeling was absent, but because feeling in the wrong moment, in the wrong place, had consequences. that extended beyond himself, and he had understood for a very long time that his responses belonged in part to the people around him who depended on them being reliable. What happened to his face when Ryan Harmon spoke his name moved through all of that training and came out the other side unchanged. He said Ryan, one word, the man's name, said in the register of someone who has spoken it many times in private and is saying it aloud for the first time in 20 years. Ryan Harmon held his gaze. Then, I knew you'd find a way, eventually. Dalton, I'm sorry it took this long. You're here now, Ryan said. So is she. He was looking past Dalton's shoulder at the doorway, at the person standing in it. Tessa stood in the pale light of the room, her jacket dark with the evidence of hours, her right leg in the improvised splint, her face carrying the particular quality of composure that is not the absence of feeling, but its container. She had her father's eyes. She had always had her father's eyes, and her mother had told her this when she was small, before she understood what it meant, and later when she understood it too well. Ryan Harmon looked at his daughter. He had watched her from a distance through intermediaries, through fragments, through the occasional carefully arranged piece of information since she was 19 years old. He had watched her become a medic and then become the other things she became. He had watched her follow the thread he had left with the patience and the absolute determination of someone who has been given a direction and has decided that arriving is not optional. He had watched all of this from places where watching was the only thing available. He had hoped. He looked at her leg, at the splint, at the dried blood on the fabric above it. You're hurt, he said. It's managed. Your leg is managed, Dad. The word came out clean and simple, and it moved through the room the way a stone moves through still water quietly but with a disturbance that spreads outward and does not stop at the edges. She had said it without deciding to say it. Or she had been deciding it at some level below conscious decision since she was 19 years old and reading a file in a borrowed room, understanding for the first time that the absence she had been living inside was not the permanent thing she had been told it was. Ryan Harmon stopped talking. Tessa crossed the room and sat on the edge of his cot. She did not perform the moment. She sat down beside the man she had spent 7 years finding, and she reached for his wrist to check his pulse, and the gesture medical habitual. The thing her hands did when they needed to be doing something was the most honest thing she could have offered. He looked at her hands on his wrist. He said, Of course. She almost smiled, something close to it. Vitals, she said. Of course, he said again. Volkov spoke when they moved him into the B3 corridor, away from the room's single entrance, into a position with better sightlines. He had been quiet since B2 holding something back, and now he sat against the wall with his hands on his knees and the expression of a man who has decided that the time for holding back has passed. I need to tell you something, he said. I should have told you upstairs. I was not certain I could trust you upstairs. He looked at Dalton. I am more certain now. Talk, Dalton said. I was not taken because of my work, Volkov said. My work was the reason they needed a cover. A plausible reason for an international extraction operation, a kidnapped scientist, a rescue mission, a team of American special operators inserted into a facility in Georgia. All of it real, all of it constructed. He looked at Tessa. They needed you here. Specifically you. The scientist was the packaging. You were what the mission was actually for. The corridor was quiet. Marsh arranged my kidnapping, Volkov continued. He arranged the intelligence that placed me here. He arranged the mission parameters that brought your team to this specific facility at this specific time. He has been doing this for 11 days because he needed a controlled environment, a place he owned, a situation he could shape, an outcome he could determine. He paused. The outcome he needed was that two specific people do not leave. Holt said very quietly, him and her. Whatever those two people know about Marsh, whatever they can prove, whatever they have been accumulating over years, he has spent 2 decades ensuring stays unprovable. He ran out of ways to manage it from a distance. Volkov looked at Tessa again. So he brought the problem here, where he could manage it directly, where the documentation would read as a mission failure. Tragic, classified, filed, and sealed. Tessa said he didn't account for the third level. No, he knew the man in that room was here, he put him here, but he did not know you were looking for him. He believed you were here because of me. Volkov paused. I think that was his only mistake. The weight of it settled over the corridor. Dalton looked at Tessa. She was already looking at the door at the end of the hall. She said, We have about 10 minutes before he understands what the mistake was. She was already moving. The contractors came down through a service access on the east end of B, to a utility shaft constructed for the facility's current use and not its original one, not in any intel package, not findable without prior knowledge of its existence. 4 men through the shaft, 4 on the stairwell above where Kowalski held the choke point. Holt caught the eastern 4 on the thermal before they fully entered B3. Contact east, 4, 30 feet. What happened in the next 11 minutes was the thing that cannot be simplified into clean sequence. It was overlapping and simultaneous, full of the rapid small decisions that are not experienced as decisions, but as execution, the body moving through what it has been trained to do in the time that thinking would waste. Weld's chest seal had shifted in the movement to B3. Not catastrophic, not yet, but the seal mattered. A man who has already had one tension pneumothorax event does not get the luxury of a compromised seal, and Tessa knew precisely how much time existed between compromised and critical. She also knew there were 4 armed men 30 feet down the corridor. The 4 contractors had the shorter timeline. She moved to the doorway of Ryan Harmon's room, the angle that gave her a sight line east, while keeping her within reach of where Weld was positioned. She brought her weapon up. Her right leg was a column of steady pain. She let it be a column. She did not let it be anything else. The first contractor came around the corridor bend in a professional crouch, moving fast, covering his movement. He was good. He was looking at the stairwell end of the corridor where he expected resistance. Tessa was at the room end. She fired twice. The contractor went down. The one behind him pulled back into the bend. "Holt," she said, "east bend. 2 remain. They'll try to bound." "Copy." She turned back into the room. 4 steps to Weld, who was braced against the wall, tracking his own situation with professional attention and not liking the numbers. New seal from her kit. Her hands moved with the specific unhurried quality of very fast hands, not slow, but so certain in their sequence they only appeared unhurried. She peeled the old seal, cleaned the surface, applied the new one. Weld said, "Go." She went. 2 shots from the corridor. Holt. A pause. 1 more. East. Clear. From the stairwell above, the rhythm of Kowalski working, measured, deliberate, each expenditure accomplishing something specific. The rhythm of a man who has held positions before and understands that holding is a practice, not an event. Dalton coordinating without radio hand signals, eye contact. The compressed language of people who have worked together long enough to need almost none of it. Tessa moved back to the doorway. Ryan Harmon had pushed himself upright on the cot. He was watching his daughter work. He had the expression of a man accounting for an absence. Not guilt exactly, which is too small a word for it, the full accounting of what it means to have missed something that cannot be returned, and the complicated process of accepting what remains. He said, "Tessa." She looked at him, eyes on the corridor, but she looked at him. "I'm sorry I couldn't." "Not now," she said. He stopped. She looked back down the corridor. The stairwell fight resolved in the way that contests between very different levels of preparation often resolve, not quickly, but with a clarity that emerges when the gap is wide enough. The contractors were competent. Kowalski was something that takes 20 years to become. When Holt came to reinforce the stairwell, the arithmetic became straightforward. When the corridor was quiet and the stairwell was quiet, Dalton did a head count. Team present. Functional within their respective limitations. Volkov intact. Ryan Harmon on his feet beside the cot, having decided that the cot no longer applied to the situation. Standing with the difficulty of a man whose body has lost much, but whose intention has not. Dalton looked at him for a moment, then at Tessa. "We move," he said. The extraction was 900 meters of open ground, under a sky that had cleared while they were underground, leaving a 3/4 moon that turned the mountain into silver and shadow. After the hours below, the cold arrived all at once, clean and sharp and absolute. They came out in a column. Dalton checked angles. All clear. They moved. Ryan Harmon was between Dalton and Holt, neither of whom held him up in any obvious way, both positioned so that if he began to go down, there would be a hand available. He had been in rooms for 6 months and in a series of similar rooms for 20 years before that. His legs remembered how to walk. They were remembering again now, step by step, on a mountain in Georgia, under a moon he had not seen in a long time. Tessa walked beside him. She did not take his arm. He did not take hers. They moved through the silver-black landscape with the careful geometry of 2 people who are still working out the shape of each other after a long absence. 20 years is not undone by one night. It has just begun. He looked at her leg, at the way she walked, the compensation the body makes when a structural element is compromised, the forward lean, The careful weight transfer, the absolute refusal to show any of it in the face. You walked on that for 9 hours, he said. It was managed. A silence. The terrain moved under them. Your mother, he said, is fine. Same house in Raleigh. I haven't told her anything. She paused. She thinks I'm on a routine deployment. She'll need to know. She'll need to know when there's something certain to tell her, not before. A pause. I learned that from the letters. He looked at her. I found the coordinates in the first one, she said. The weather report about the town near the river. It took me 4 months to decode them. I was 19, I had no resources. I had time and the certainty that you put them there for a reason. She walked 2 more steps. They were the coordinates of the farm in North Carolina, where you grew up. He said very quietly, you went. I stood in the field in front of it. I understood what you were telling me. Not where you were, who you were before all of it. Before the Navy, before the call sign, before any of it. You were telling me there was a person who existed before everything else. Ryan Harmon looked at his daughter for a long moment. That's exactly what I was telling you, he said. He put his hand on her shoulder as they walked. Not for support, neither of them was in a position to support the other physically, and they both knew it. The gesture of a man who has not been able to put his hand on his daughter's shoulder for 20 years, and is doing it now because the opportunity exists and he has learned in 20 years the precise value of opportunities that exist. She did not stop walking, but something in the line of her shoulders changed. A small thing, the kind of change visible only to someone who had been watching carefully enough to know what it looked like before. Kowalski was 10 feet behind them. He turned away and looked at the LZ where the little bird would arrive in 4 minutes. He had spent 14 hours constructing a specific understanding of who Tessa Harmon was. He had been wrong in the way confident people are wrong, not about the facts, but about what the facts meant. He had seen the category and treated the category as the person. Small and treated it as insufficient. Quiet and treated it as nothing to say. She had said everything she needed to say. In a stairwell, in a corridor, in a darkened room at the end of a hallway that didn't exist on any official record. She had said it with a needle in the dark and a shot at 820 meters and 11 minutes of doing 2 things at once on a broken leg. She had said it without ever raising her voice. He walked in silence for the rest of the distance to the L's, thinking about what he was going to say to her. The helicopter came in low from the south. They loaded Harmon and Volkov first, then Weld. Rourke, who had managed his injured arm through everything that followed the mine and not said a word about it. Sloan, Holt, Tessa came last. Kowalski had positioned himself on her left side since the facility exit the side that required more coverage given the terrain in her leg. He had not offered assistance. He had simply been present in the specific way that means if you need something, it is here, and if you do not need it, it costs you nothing. She stepped to the aircraft. She needed both hands on the frame to pull herself in on one functional leg. She did it without asking. Kowalski put one hand briefly on the frame beside hers, not pulling, not lifting, just there during the half second when the weight transfer was most difficult. She got in. He got in after her. The little bird lifted. The mountain fell away. The Caucasus opened in the moonlight, vast and cold and ancient, and entirely unconcerned with what had happened on one of its lower slopes in the preceding hours. Mountains are like that. They hold everything that happens on them without preference and without judgment and without any investment in outcomes. Tessa looked out at the terrain falling away. She had been looking for this for 7 years. She had found it on a broken leg in a facility that did not officially exist at the end of a mission designed to ensure she never found it. She had found it because Marsh had understood her as a threat to be managed toward a controlled location, and what he had failed to understand was that the controlling variable in this situation had never been geography. It had been her. She looked at her father. He was sitting across from her with the expression of a man seeing things he had decided he would not see again, processing it at the speed that prevents something important from being lost in the hurry. He caught her looking. She looked back out at the mountains. He did not look away. Ramstein Air Base, Western Germany. The hospital there receives people in conditions that require immediate attention and does not ask unnecessary questions about things that are classified, and the staff are in the specific tradition of military medical personnel. Very good. Tessa was in surgery for 2 hours and 40 minutes. The fracture was a complete break in the distal fibula with a hairline propagation into the tibia. Not the stress fracture Sloan had initially assessed, but a complete break that had been operating as a stress fracture for his first portion of existence, and had finished the transition sometime around the second shot on the ridge. The orthopedic surgeon asked the assisting nurse afterward, in a corridor, whether she had been informed correctly that the patient had walked and operated on this injury for approximately 9 hours. The nurse confirmed it. The surgeon was quiet. Then he said she would not know once it healed that it had ever happened. Ryan Harmon was in the room when Tessa came out of recovery. He was in the chair beside the bed wearing a hospital gown and a blanket which he had not exchanged for the bed because the bed was for his daughter. He was awake. There was apparently a threshold of accumulated sleeplessness beyond which additional hours ceased to matter, and he had crossed that threshold some years ago. When she opened her eyes, he was there. She looked at him in the unfocused way of someone whose systems are coming back online in sequence, not yet at full configuration. Then focus returned. She said, "Still here." He said, "Still here." She looked at the ceiling, then at him. "I made a promise to my mother," she said, "when I was 17. She asked me not to join the military, not to carry a weapon. She had already lost one person to that life. She said she couldn't carry the weight of a second." She paused. "I broke the promise. I enlisted at 18. I told myself I would be a medic, that I would heal people and not carry a gun, and it would be close enough to what she asked that it would count." He waited. "It didn't count," she said. "I knew that. I've known it for a long time. I was using the letter of the promise to avoid the spirit of it, and I knew that too. You carried a weapon tonight, more than once. You also saved Weld's life. You brought the team out. Both things are true," she said. "That's the part I've been working out for years. Both things can be true." She turned her head to look at him. "I need to call her. I need to tell her something. I don't know yet what the right thing is to tell her." "Tell her what she can hold on to tonight," he said. "The rest can wait until I can say it myself." She looked at him. "You're planning to come home, if that's still possible. It will take time. There will be inquiries, classifications, institutional resistance to acknowledging that any of this happened. It could take a year." "I've been waiting 20 years, he said. "A year is a number I understand." The room was quiet. Outside, the base continued its permanent temporary existence. Aircraft vehicles, the distant mechanical voice of a PA system conveying information that had nothing to do with this room. She said, "I found the bird too." He looked at her. The third letter, the gray bird that came to the window every morning for 3 weeks and then stopped. "You wrote about it like an observation." She held his gaze. "You meant I am here. I am still here. And if I stop being here, the letters will stop. But I am still here." He said very quietly, "Yes." "I knew," she said. "I kept all 8 letters." He put his hand over hers on the blanket. She did not move her hand. Kowalski came to her room on the second day. He came alone without announcement. He stood in the doorway for a moment before he entered, not his usual way, which was to move through doorways rather than pause at them. He came in and stood at the foot of her bed. "I owe you an apology," he said. She looked at him. "Not a private one," he said. "I said what I said in front of the team. I said it more than once. I said it in a way that was intended to be heard, and it was heard." He met her eyes directly in the way of a man who has decided that the minimum he can do is not look away. "I was wrong. Not about the general principle. Medics and operators are different roles, and I hold to that distinction. I was wrong about you specifically. I made a judgment before I had the information, and I kept making it after the information was coming in." He paused. "You identified Weld's pneumothorax before anyone else got there. You held position on a broken leg for 9 hours without telling anyone. You made 2 shots that I have been running through my head every hour since, and I cannot arrive at an explanation for them that fits inside my understanding of what is possible." He stopped. "I don't have a great deal of practice apologizing. So I'll say it plainly, I was wrong about you. I'm sorry." Tessa looked at him for a moment. She said, "You stood in front of me when I was working on Weld. You put yourself between me and the corridor without anyone asking you to. That's not nothing," she said. "That's what someone does when they've decided another person is worth protecting. You made that decision before you'd consciously made it." She looked at him steadily. "We're square." Kowalski held her gaze. Then he nodded once in the way that men nod when words have done what they can, and the rest has to be carried in something that doesn't have a name. He left without saying anything more. Holt was in the hallway. He had not been listening. He had simply been nearby in the way he was often nearby, present without intruding, available without requiring anything. Kowalski walked past him. Holt said, "How'd it go?" Kowalski said, "Fine." Holt said, "Good." They walked together toward the cafeteria and neither said anything else. and that was sufficient for both of them. On the third day, a rear admiral from Naval Special Warfare Command flew in from Coronado. He came to her room without ceremony. He was 61 years old with the particular quality of someone who has spent a career doing serious things and has no need to demonstrate this through manner or decoration. He pulled a chair to the side of her bed and sat down, and he talked to her for 20 minutes about what happened and what would happen next and what the institution owed her and what it owed her father. When he was done talking, he reached into his jacket pocket and set a seal trident on the blanket beside her hand. Not a ceremony, not a speech, just the object placed with intention. He said, "Your father earned this. You made sure we had the chance to acknowledge it. And you," he paused, looking at her for a moment, "what you did in that facility is not something we have a commendation for. We don't have a category for it yet. We'll need to build one." Tessa looked at the trident. She did not pick it up. She said, "He'll want that back when he's able to receive it properly." The admiral looked at her. A small thing moved across his face, something that on a less disciplined face would have been called moved. "He'll get it," he said. "That's a promise." 6 months later, Tessa Harmon stood before 14 people at Naval Medical Center, Portsmouth, Virginia. The room was a standard training facility, institutional lighting, folding chairs, a whiteboard at the front, still ghosted with the previous session's writing. The kind of room that exists in every military installation in the world, designed to move knowledge from people who have it to people who need it. On the whiteboard behind her, 7 words: heal when you can, fight when you must. The 14 people in the chairs were Navy corpsmen at various points in their careers. Some were new, some carried 2 or 3 deployments. One, a man named Reeves in the back row, had 11 years and the quality of someone who comes to a training room not to be taught but to confirm that what he already knows is worth knowing. They had been told that this course, integrated combat medicine, was new to the curriculum. They had been told it had been developed in response to operational feedback from multiple theaters. They had not been told much more than that. Tessa looked at them. "This course will teach you to do 2 things at the same time," she said. "Not in sequence, not in rotation. At the same time, while under fire, while your team needs both of you, the medic and the operator, in the same moment." She let that sit. "That sounds like a description of a problem." It is. And solving it is some of the hardest work you will do, because the mind wants to finish one task before it begins another, and in a firefight, the mind does not get what it wants. In the front row, Petty Officer 3rd Class Colt Waverly, 23 years old, the youngest person in the room, the youngest member of the team from 9 hours in a mountain in Georgia 6 months ago, who had transferred to a corpsman billet at his own request, a request that had required 3 conversations with his chain of command, and which he had pursued with the specific quiet persistence of someone who has watched a person do something and decided that path is worth following, sat with his notebook open and his pen uncapped. He wrote nothing for the first 10 minutes. He was watching her too carefully to write. He noticed the way he was learning to notice things, the slight quality in her gait when she moved to the side of the whiteboard. He noticed it and followed it without drawing conclusions, because he was 23 and had not yet accumulated the pattern recognition to understand what he was seeing. Later, after deployments, after his own hard moments in confined spaces with bad options, he would understand. He would understand it because she would have taught him over 16 weeks in the years that followed what it means to refuse the option of stopping. "I'm going to tell you a story," Tessa said. Not a hypothetical, not a scenario designed to illustrate a principle. A real story from a real situation, so that you understand in the specific way you can only understand things that actually happened, why we are here, and what this training is designed to give you." The room was entirely still. "The story involves a broken leg," she said, "a Barrett 50 caliber rifle, a needle decompression in the dark, and a call sign that you will not find in any official record anywhere." 14 people leaned forward slightly in their chairs. "Let's begin," she said. 3 weeks after that first class on a Tuesday afternoon in October, a man with gray-white hair and a slight difficulty with stairs, the residue of 20 years in rooms that did not have adequate space for the movements his body needed, knocked on a door in a residential neighborhood in Raleigh, North Carolina. He had been preparing for this for 20 years in the abstract, and for 3 weeks in the specific, and none of the preparation had produced anything that seemed adequate, because some things do not become adequate through rehearsal. They only become possible through doing. The door opened. He had been afraid that 20 years would have compressed and altered his memory into something that was his construction rather than the truth. He looked at the woman in the doorway and understood that he had remembered correctly. She looked at him for a long time without speaking. The afternoon was quiet around them. A dog barked somewhere down the street. A car passed. The ordinary, irreplaceable continuity of an ordinary neighborhood on an ordinary afternoon proceeding without any acknowledgement of the fact that what was happening at this specific door was not ordinary at all. She said his name, just his name. The way she had said it the first time she ever said it before either of them knew what saying it would come to mean, in the years when it had seemed impossible that it could mean this much. He said, "I'm sorry it took so long." She opened the door wider. He went home. That same evening, Tessa sat in her quarters at Portsmouth and looked at the phone in her hand for a while before she called. The conversation was 41 minutes long. It began the way their conversations always began. How are you? How is the weather? Are you eating? And then it moved in the way that conversations between people who love each other eventually move toward the things that needed to be said. She did not say everything. She said enough. She said she was sorry she had broken the promise. She said she understood the weight her mother had carried for 23 years and was not asking for the breaking to be made retroactively acceptable. She was telling the truth because the truth was overdue and she was tired of the distance it created to leave it unspoken. Her mother was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Your father would be proud of you." Tessa looked out the window of her quarters at the sky above Portsmouth, a band of orange at the horizon beneath deepening blue, the kind of sky that exists for 15 minutes and then becomes night and takes the color with it. She said, "I know." She didn't say anything else. Not yet. There would be time. There was time now, which was a thing she had not been certain she could say 6 months ago. There was time for the conversations that needed space in the right moment and two people sitting in the same room rather than holding the weight of the distance between them. There was time for her father to find his way back into the world he had been removed from, which would take the slow institutional time that these things always take, and she had learned something about patience that she had not known at 19. She had learned it one step at a time on a mountain in the dark. After she ended the call, she sat in the quiet of the room for a while. She thought about the farm in North Carolina, the field, the ordinary, irreplaceable fact of a place where a person she had spent her adult life trying to find had once been a child before he knew what his life would ask of him, before any of it. She thought about the stairwell in the Caucasus, 17 steps, the counting. She thought about Kowalski standing at her left shoulder on open ground at 2 a.m, not speaking, not offering anything she hadn't asked for, just there. She thought about 900 meters under a three-quarter moon with everything she was carrying and the helicopter at the end of it. She thought that was the easy part. On her desk, a new email had arrived. The subject line read, "Mission Brief 0800, C Classification Alpha." She read it. She set the phone down. She looked out the window at the last of the orange, leaving the sky, the stars appearing over Portsmouth, the same way they were appearing at the same moment over a rehabilitation facility in Maryland, where a man with gray-white hair was finishing his evening physical therapy and looking at the same sky through a different window, thinking about what he intended to do with the time he had been given back. Same stars, different windows, still here. She opened the email. She read it a second time more carefully. Then she stood up and went to work.